Unit 731. From 1936 to 1945, in the occupied Chinese region of Manchuria, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a covert facility called Unit 731, officially presented as a disease control center. In reality, it became the site of some of the most unethical and disturbing human research ever documented. Under the direction of microbiologist General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 conducted large-scale experiments on civilians and prisoners of war, many of whom were Chinese, Korean, and Russian, without consent and with complete disregard for human life. Victims were referred to as logs to dehumanize them, and were subjected to extreme conditions in the name of scientific advancement. Numerous testimonies and declassified records revealed that subjects were intentionally exposed to deadly bacteria like plague, anthrax, and cholera, with researchers monitoring the full progression of illness. Invasive procedures were performed without proper care or anesthesia, all to observe internal reactions. In other cases, researchers simulated extreme weather exposure, especially frostbite, by freezing limbs and then testing treatments, often by striking or cutting the affected area. Pregnant women were also used in these studies to understand transmission between mother and child, and some children were involved in blood-related experiments. According to US intelligence files and survivor accounts, Unit 731 also conducted field tests on nearby villages, releasing infected fleas through ceramic bombs, which led to widespread outbreaks and significant civilian losses. Historians estimate that over 300,000 people died directly or indirectly as a result of Unit 731 activities. After World War II, the world was shocked by Nazi war crimes, but the horrors of Unit 731 were largely hidden. Instead of facing trial, many of its lead scientists were quietly offered immunity by the US in exchange for their research on biological warfare, a deal later confirmed through declassified government documents. General Ishii never faced justice, and many of his colleagues went on to successful career in science, government, and business. For decades, the Japanese government denied the existence of Unit 731, and public discussion was nearly non-existent. Only in the late 20th century did survivors and researchers begin to piece together the full truth. Yet to this day, no one has ever been officially held accountable. MK-Ultra. During the height of the Cold War, the US government launched a classified program so strange and ethically questionable that it sounds like science fiction. Its name was MK-Ultra, a covert project led by the CIA between the early 1950s and 1973. The goal? To develop techniques for mind control, psychological manipulation, and even truth extraction, driven by fears the Soviet or Chinese governments were already doing the same. But what started as intelligence gathering quickly spiraled into a disturbing network of unauthorized human experimentation. Under MK-Ultra, the CIA worked with over 80 institutions, including hospitals, prisons, and universities. The experiments were often done without the subject's knowledge or consent. The most infamous method involved administering high doses of psychedelic drugs, particularly LSD, to unsuspecting individuals, sometimes everyday civilians, military personnel, or even CIA agents themselves. In some cases, participants were kept in isolation for days while being observed under the influence, unaware that they had even been drugged. The goal was to see if the human mind could be broken down and reprogrammed. One disturbing example is the case of Frank Olson, a US Army scientist who was allegedly given LSD without his knowledge during a CIA retreat. Just days later, he fell to his death from a 13th floor hotel window in New York. Although initially ruled a suicide, later investigation raised serious doubts, and his family believes he may have been silenced due to what he had witnessed. There were also experiments involving electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, and extreme forms of hypnosis, all designed to manipulate memory, behavior, or willpower. What makes MK-Ultra particularly unsettling is how long it operated in the shadows. When details of the program began to emerge in the mid-1970s, thanks in part to journalist Seymour Hersh and the Church Committee hearings, the CIA admitted to destroying most of the records in 1973. As a result, Much of what we know today comes from survivor testimonies and a small number of recovered documents. In 1977, a cache of 20,000 previously undiscovered files brought new evidence to light, confirming that hundreds, if not thousands, of people were affected by these secret experiments. No high-ranking officials were ever prosecuted for MK Ultra. Victims received little to no compensation, and many never knew they had been part of a classified program. While the CIA has since stated that such research no longer takes place, the legacy of MK Ultra continues to haunt the public imagination, raising difficult questions about trust, secrecy, and the limits of state power. The Monster Study. In 1939, at the height of the eugenics movement in the United States, a group of researchers at the University of Iowa conducted what would later be called the Monster Study, a speech therapy experiment so ethically flawed that it was kept hidden for decades. The study was led by Dr. Wendell Johnson, a respected speech pathologist, and carried out by one of his graduate students, Mary Tudor, who was only 22 at the time. Their goal was to explore the origins of stuttering, particularly whether it was a learned behavior or something people were born with. But instead of using adult volunteers, they targeted orphans, many of whom had no speech problems at all. 22 children living at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home were split into two groups. One group received positive reinforcement for their speech, being praised and encouraged, told they spoke well. But the other group, which included children with perfectly normal speech, was subjected to constant criticism, correction, and psychological pressure. They were told they had speech defects, warned not to speak unless they could do so perfectly, and shamed for any perceived mistake. These children were made to believe that they were broken, that their voices were wrong. The result were devastating. Several children in the negative feedback group developed severe speech anxiety, and some began to stutter as a direct result of the pressure. Others became withdrawn, emotionally distressed, and socially isolated. The long-term trauma followed them into adulthood, even though they had no idea they had been part of an experiment until the study was uncovered in 2001, over 60 years later. Many of the victims had never recovered from the psychological damage, and some even filed lawsuits against the state of Iowa after the truth came out. No formal apology was issued until 2001, and even then, the university emphasized that the experiment had been conducted under different ethical standards. But for the children involved, that meant little. The name Monster Study wasn't given by the media. It was coined by other researchers at the time, who were horrified by the methods. And despite its shocking premise, the results of the study were never even officially published. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1932, during the height of racial segregation in the United States, the U.S. Public Health Service began what they called a medical study in Macon County, Alabama, home to a large, impoverished black population. The official title was the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. On paper, the goal was to track the natural progression of syphilis in African American men. But what the study truly became was a 40-year deception, one that would later be called one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. A total of 600 black men were enrolled in the study. Of these, 399 had syphilis, while 201 did not and served as a control group. All were poor, uneducated sharecroppers who had little access to healthcare. They were promised free medical treatment, meals, and even burial insurance. But they were never told they had syphilis, and were instead informed they were being treated for a vague condition called bad blood, a term commonly used in the South that could mean anything from fatigue to anemia. Many of the participants trusted the doctors, believing they were finally receiving care from a government that had long ignored them. In reality, they were being monitored, not treated. Even after penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in 1947, the researchers made a deliberate decision to withhold it. Letters from government doctors show coordinated efforts to ensure the men didn't receive treatment from local physicians or military examiners. In some cases, they were even prevented from joining the armed forces, because military doctors might diagnose and treat them, which would interfere with the study. The consequences were devastating. Over time, many of the infected men lost their eyesight, developed neurological disorders, went insane, or died slow and painful deaths. Their wives unknowingly contracted the disease, and several children were born with congenital syphilis, living with life-altering effects. These weren't anonymous statistics. These were real people, real families, trapped in an experiment they didn't even know they were part of. The truth only came to light in 1972, thanks to Peter Buxton, a former public health service employee who became deeply disturbed after learning of the study. When his internal complaints were ignored, he leaked the information to a reporter at the Associated Press, triggering nationwide outrage. Congress held hearings, the study was shut down, and a class action lawsuit was filed. In 1974, the government agreed to a $10 million settlement with the surviving participants and their families, though many argued that no financial amount could ever make up for what had been done. Decades later, in 1997, President Bill Clinton delivered a formal apology at the White House, with surviving participants and their families in attendance. The Tuskegee syphilis study has left an enduring scar on the American healthcare system. To this day, it is cited as a key reason for mistrust of government and medical institutions among Black Americans, a mistrust that resurfaced during the COVID-19 pandemic and other public health efforts. Perhaps what makes Tuskegee so disturbing is not just the cruelty, but the quiet, methodical way it was carried out. It wasn't a rogue experiment in a hidden lab. It was approved, funded, and protected by public health officials and scientists for 4 decades. No one stopped it, and almost no one was ever held accountable. The David Reimer case. In 1966, a baby boy named Bruce Reimer was born in Winnipeg, Canada, alongside his identical twin brother. When Bruce was just 8 months old, a routine circumcision procedure went horribly wrong. Due to a mechanical malfunction during the operation, his entire penis was accidentally destroyed. His parents, devastated and desperate, began searching for answers. That's when they were introduced to Dr. John Money, a psychologist and sexologist at Johns Hopkins University, who had built his reputation on a bold theory. Gender identity is not determined by biology, but by upbringing. Dr. Money saw Bruce's accident as a perfect opportunity to prove his theory to the world. He convinced Bruce's parents to raise the boy as a girl, claiming that if they started early enough, the child would adapt fully and live a normal, happy life. Bruce was renamed Brenda, underwent surgery to construct female-like genitalia, and was given estrogen hormones during adolescence to develop breasts. The parents followed the psychologist's guidance closely, dressing Brenda in girls' clothing and raising her as female, all while keeping the truth hidden from her. But from the beginning, things didn't go the way Dr. Money had predicted. Brenda didn't behave like a typical girl. She rejected dolls, preferred rough play, and insisted on urinating, standing up, even though she physically couldn't. She was angry, isolated, and constantly in conflict with her peers. At school, other children bullied her mercilessly for her appearance and behavior. As time went on, the psychological toll deepened. Meanwhile, Dr. Money publicly praised the case as a total success, even publishing it in medical journal as proof that gender could be reassigned successfully through environment alone. But behind the scenes, Brenda's therapy sessions were disturbing. Reports later revealed that Dr. Money forced the Reimer twins, Brenda and her brother, to engage in highly inappropriate and psychologically damaging activities under the guise of gender identity reinforcement. These sessions left deep trauma in both children. By age 13, Brenda was suicidal. Her parents finally told her the truth, that she had been born male. The news was both devastating and liberating. Brenda immediately began transitioning back to living as a male, choosing the name David. He underwent multiple surgeries to reverse the earlier procedures and began hormone therapy. He eventually married a woman and even became a stepfather to her children, but the trauma never left him. In 2002, David's twin brother died of an overdose after years of depression, something many believe was linked to the experiments they endured. Just 2 years later, in 2004, David Reimer took his own life at the age of 38. The case, once hailed as a scientific breakthrough, has since become one of the most tragic and cautionary tales in modern medical history. The human radiation experiments. In the aftermath of World War II, as the United States entered the nuclear age, a new kind of war began, the race for atomic dominance. But behind the scenes, a chilling set of experiments unfolded across the country, quietly funded by the US government. From the late 1940s through the 1970s, thousands of unsuspecting citizens were exposed to radioactive materials, not on the battlefield, but in hospitals, schools, and even their homes. These experiments were part of a classified program under the Atomic Energy Commission, designed to understand how radiation affected the human body. The problem? The test subjects were never told what was being done to them. In one of the earliest documented cases, 18 hospital patients, most of whom were poor, sick, or mentally ill, were secretly injected with plutonium between 1945 and 1947. None of them gave informed consent. In fact, they were told they were receiving routine treatments. These weren't low doses either. Some of the injections contained levels of plutonium that far exceeded what was considered safe even at the time. The goal was to study how the body absorbed and expelled radioactive elements, but the data came at a disturbing human cost. Most of the patients died within years, and for decades, their families never knew the truth. But that was just the beginning. In Vanderbilt University Hospital, pregnant women were given radioactive iron during prenatal care, again without their consent. Researchers wanted to see how the material transferred from mother to fetus. Out of 751 women, at least 3 children later died of cancer, and other reported lifelong health issues. In another case, mentally disabled children at the Fernald State School in Massachusetts were fed radioactive oatmeal as part of a study run by MIT and Harvard researchers, with the backing of Quaker Oats no less. The children were told they had joined a science club and were rewarded with toys and extra food. The experiments continued into the 1960s and 70s, expanding into studies involving uranium miners, soldiers, and even entire cities. In St. Louis and parts of the Midwest, the US Army sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide, a potentially toxic chemical, into low-income neighborhoods to test how radioactive particles would spread through urban environments. Residents, most of them poor and black, were never informed. Many later developed respiratory illnesses and cancers, sparking outrage when the story was revealed decades later. These experiments remained secret until the 1990s, when a series of investigative reports and congressional hearings finally brought them to light. In 1994, President Bill Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments to uncover the full extent of the testing. Thousands of pages of documents were declassified, and the findings were damning. The committee found that informed consent was routinely ignored. Records were intentionally destroyed or altered, and entire communities had been exposed without warning. Despite public apologies, very few victims received compensation, and even fewer saw justice. In many cases, the government argued that the risks were minimal or unknown at the time, statements contradicted by internal documents showing that officials knew exactly what they were doing. Sleep deprivation and sensory isolation. While most people associate the CIA's secret projects with LSD and mind control, some of the most disturbing psychological experiments ever conducted involve something far more subtle and far more effective: deprivation. In the 1950s and 60s, scientists began to explore how the lack of sleep, sound, light, and even human contact could affect the mind. What they found was terrifying. It doesn't take much to break a person, just time, silence, and a closed room. One of the most infamous figures in this research was Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist whose work was funded in part by the CIA under the MK Ultra program. At the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, Cameron developed a method called psychic driving, a process that combined drug-induced sleep, isolation, and repeated audio messages to erase and rebuild a patient's mind. But before the so-called rebuilding came the breaking. Patients were subjected to days or even weeks of extreme sleep deprivation, kept awake with stimulants and shock therapy, then placed in total sensory isolation. No sound, no light, no clocks, no windows. In some cases, patients were tied to beds, blindfolded, and had their ears covered, forcing them to exist in a state of complete disconnection from reality. In these conditions, the human mind doesn't just slow down, it fractures. Volunteers, many of whom checked in for mild anxiety or postpartum depression, emerged with severe memory loss, speech difficulty, and emotional instability. Some couldn't recognize their own families. Others lost the ability to read or write. These were not criminals or enemy combatants. They were ordinary citizens who had no idea they were part of a CIA-linked experiment. Similar tests were conducted at McGill University, Stanford, and other institutions across North America. In one well-known study at McGill in the 1950s, student volunteers were paid to sit in a completely silent, padded room with opaque goggles, cotton gloves, and cardboard cuffs to limit movement and touch. Most subjects couldn't last more than 48 hours. After just 2 days, participants began hallucinating, reporting flashing lights, distorted perception of time, and intense paranoia. One student saw squirrels marching in formation. Another heard an orchestra playing inside his head. The longer the isolation continued, the worse the symptom became. Many had to drop out of the experiment early due to overwhelming psychological distress. While these tests were sometimes presented as academic research, they had real military applications. Intelligence agencies wanted to know how long a person could endure isolation before breaking, especially in interrogation settings. Sleep deprivation, in particular, became a standard method in psychological operations and prisoner questioning. It left no physical scars, but it shattered minds just as effectively. What makes these experiments particularly disturbing is that many of the victims didn't know what they were signing up for, or were manipulated into participation with vague language and false assurances. The long-term effects? Lifelong trauma, depression, PTSD, and in some cases, complete personality change. To this day, some former patients of Dr. Cameron and similar programs are still seeking justice. The Aversion project, during the 1970s and 80s, under the apartheid regime in South Africa, a secret and highly unethical military program was carried out at the Voortrekkerhout Military Hospital near Pretoria. It was known as the Aversion Project, and its goal was chilling: to identify and eliminate homosexuality within the South African Defence Force. Backed by a deeply conservative, religiously driven government, and under the command of a military psychiatrist named Dr. Aubrey Levin, the program targeted young soldiers suspected of being gay, many of whom had been conscripted and had no choice but to serve. The process often began with forced psychiatric evaluations. If a soldier was merely suspected of homosexuality based on rumor, behavior, or confession, they could be referred for treatment. These treatments included chemical castration, electroshock therapy, and forced aversion conditioning. In aversion therapy sessions, patients were shown homoerotic imagery and then immediately subjected to electric shocks or nausea-inducing drugs, with the goal of associating same-sex attraction with pain, disgust, or fear. It was psychological torture disguised as medicine, but it didn't stop there. In the most extreme cases, soldiers were forcibly subjected to gender reassignment surgeries without their consent. Some were told it would solve their problem. Others were never told what was happening until they woke up post-surgery. Many were institutionalized afterward, discharged dishonorably, or simply disappeared into psychiatric hospitals. It's estimated that as many as 900 soldiers were subjected to forced surgeries during this time, though exact number remain unknown due to missing records and the secrecy of the operation. What's perhaps most disturbing is that these actions were not the work of rogue individuals. They were sanctioned by military leadership and embedded in the medical system of the apartheid state. Dr. Levin, the program's lead figure, was never held accountable in South Africa. In fact, he later emigrated to Canada, where he continued working as a psychiatrist until allegations of sexual misconduct against male patients eventually led to his conviction and imprisonment in 2013. Survivors of the Aversion Project have described lasting trauma, both physical and psychological. Many suffer from PTSD, identity confusion, and irreversible bodily harm. Others have remained silent, fearing stigma or retribution. Despite calls for justice, the South African government has never issued a formal apology, and many documents related to the program were allegedly destroyed or lost during the transition out of apartheid. The Guatemala syphilis experiments. In the quiet years after World War II, between 1946 and 1948, a secret experiment was carried out in Guatemala, one that would remain buried for more than 6 decades, behind the walls of prisons, orphanages, and mental institutions. American doctors, working with the Guatemalan government, deliberately infected more than 1,300 people with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid without their knowledge or consent. The official reason: to study how well penicillin could prevent and treat sexually transmitted infections. The unofficial reality: it was one of the most blatant violations of medical ethics in modern history. The lead physician behind the project was Dr. John Charles Cutler, a U.S. Public Health Service doctor tasked with overseeing disease prevention. But in Guatemala, free from American oversight and ethical constraints, Cutler and his team crossed every imaginable line. At first, they paid sex workers, many of whom were themselves infected, to visit Guatemalan soldiers and prisoners in state facilities. The idea was to expose the men to infection naturally, and then study how the disease developed and responded to treatment. But when that method proved inconsistent, the researchers turned to more direct methods. They inoculated patients deliberately, applying infected fluids onto abrasions or open wounds, injecting bacteria by needle, or swabbing it into the eyes and genitals of test subjects. These weren't volunteers. Many were orphans, mental patients, and prisoners, individuals in no position to refuse or even understand what was being done to them. They were told it was medical care. It wasn't. It was exploitation. Out of more than 5,000 people involved in the study, at least 1,308 were intentionally infected, and hundreds never received treatment at all. Some developed long-term complications, neurological damage, chronic pain, and disfigurement. Others died without ever knowing they had been used as test subjects in a foreign government's medical experiment. For more than 60 years, this story remained hidden. There were no publications, no announcements, and no acknowledgement. The records were filed away in storage, forgotten, or perhaps hidden on purpose. It wasn't until 2010 that the truth came to light, when medical historian Susan Riverby uncovered Cutler's archived files and revealed the existence of the experiments to the public. The response was immediate and furious. In 2010, President Barack Obama formally apologized to the Guatemalan government. A special commission was formed to investigate the details of the study. Their findings were blunt. The experiments had violated every basic principle of informed consent, human dignity, and ethical science, even by the standards of the 1940s. Yet despite these conclusions, no one was ever prosecuted, and the victims' families have never received compensation. In many cases, the survivors have already passed away, and those still living remain haunted by the scars, both physical and invisible. Forced sterilization in America. Long before the world had heard the term genetic engineering, the United States was already trying to reshape its population, not with science fiction, but with scalpels. For much of the 20th century, state governments across America ran a series of forced sterilization programs, rooted in the belief that certain people were unfit to reproduce. These weren't isolated events. They were backed by laws, supported by doctors, and approved by the Supreme Court, and they happened to tens of thousands of people. The foundation of these programs was a twisted ideology called eugenics, the belief that society could be improved by controlling who was allowed to have children. Influential figures across medicine, law, and politics argued that poverty, mental illness, criminality, and even promiscuity were inherited traits. The solution? Stop those people from reproducing. The first sterilization law was passed in Indiana in 1907, and within decades, over 30 states had similar laws in place. The targets were often poor, disabled, institutionalized, or simply labeled as morally defective. Many were women, many were children. Some were institutionalized for being orphaned, illiterate, or even just disobedient. Once labeled feeble-minded, a vague term used to describe anyone deemed mentally deficient, they could be sterilized without their consent, and sometimes without their knowledge. One of the most infamous legal cases was Buck v. Bell in 1927, in which the Supreme Court upheld Virginia's sterilization law. The plaintiff, Carrie Buck, was a teenager who had been institutionalized after being raped by her foster cousin. She was labeled feeble-minded and ordered to be sterilized. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing the majority opinion, coldly declared, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That sentence justified decades of forced sterilization in the name of public good. The victims came from every background, but the system disproportionately targeted Black, Indigenous, and Latino women. In North Carolina, the state sterilized more than 7,600 people from the 1920s to the 1970s, and as late as the 1960s, nearly 65% of sterilizations were performed on African Americans, even though they made up less than a third of the population. In California, over 20,000 people were sterilized in state hospitals. Some were told they needed an operation for appendicitis or birth control, and woke up to discover they'd been sterilized permanently. Even more disturbing is how long these programs lasted. Many continued well into the 1970s, and in some cases, well beyond. In the early 2000s, reports emerged of Indigenous women in Canada and immigrant detainees in US ICE facilities being sterilized without proper consent. The echoes of eugenics hadn't gone away, they had just evolved. Only in recent years have some victims received apologies or compensation. In 2013, North Carolina became one of the first states to approve financial reparation for sterilization survivors, but many victims never lived to see justice, and some still don't even know what was done to them. The Willowbrook experiments. In the 1950s and 60s, on Staten Island, New York, stood a massive state-run institution known as the Willowbrook State School. It was supposed to be a place of care, a facility for children with intellectual disabilities, but behind its closed doors, it became the site of one of the most disturbing medical experiments in American history. For over a decade, doctors deliberately infected hundreds of vulnerable children with hepatitis, not to cure them, but to observe the natural progression of the disease. The experiments were led by Dr. Saul Krugman, a respected physician affiliated with New York University. Backed by government funding, Krugman wanted to better understand hepatitis, which was spreading rapidly in institutions like Willowbrook due to overcrowding and poor sanitation. But instead of observing naturally occurring outbreaks, he and his team accelerated the process. They intentionally exposed children to the virus by feeding them extracts from the feces of infected patients, sometimes mixed into chocolate milk, sometimes administered directly. These were not healthy volunteers. They were children with disabilities, many of whom were nonverbal, unable to consent, and often completely unaware of what was being done to them. In many cases, parents were pressured to allow their children to be part of the study in exchange for admission to Willowbrook, a state-supported institution for children with intellectual disabilities, which was constantly overcrowded and had long waiting lists. Over the years, more than 700 children were infected. Some developed severe symptoms, others became long-term carriers. The goal was to trace how the disease behaved. But to do so, the researchers sacrificed ethics for data, prioritizing observation over protection. When details of the experiments became public in the early 1970s, there was widespread outrage. Journalist Geraldo Rivera famously exposed the horrific conditions at Willowbrook in a televised investigation, showing overcrowded rooms, children left unattended, and widespread neglect. But the experiments themselves were defended by some in the medical community, who argued that hepatitis was already rampant in the facility and that the research had helped lead to vaccines. That logic, however, ignored the fact that these children were deliberately targeted, isolated, and harmed for a goal they never agreed to be part of. Willowbrook was eventually shut down in 1987, but its legacy still lingers. It remains a haunting example of how even the most vulnerable, children with disabilities, can be exploited in the name of science. Colonia Dignidad. hidden deep in the Chilean countryside, behind barbed wire fences and armed guards. There existed a secluded community known as Colonia Dignidad, or the Colony of Dignity. To outsiders, it looked like a self-sustaining German settlement, peaceful, religious, isolated by choice. But inside, it was anything but peaceful. For decades, Colonia Dignidad functioned as a secret cult compound, a torture center, and most disturbingly, a place where its leader conducted disturbing psychological and medical experiments on his own followers, especially children. The man behind it all was Paul Schaefer, a former Nazi medic and charismatic preacher who fled Germany after being accused of child abuse. In 1961, he resurfaced in Chile, convincing hundreds of German immigrants to follow him and build a new utopian society based on strict Christian values, discipline, and order. But what he created was a nightmarish dictatorship in miniature, one where he had absolute control over every aspect of life. Inside the colony, families were separated, men and women were forbidden to marry, and children were raised by the community, often without ever knowing who their parents were. Schaefer outlawed any kind of affection, education, or outside influence, but behind the strict rules was a far darker reality. Schaefer used Colonia Dignidad as a personal laboratory, where he could carry out experiments on the human mind and body without interference. Children were often subjected to heavy sedation with mysterious drugs, then kept in isolation for days. Some were forced to undergo electroshock treatments, not as therapy, but as punishment or control. Schaefer was obsessed with erasing sexual desire and individuality, and many boys were victims of systematic abuse under the guise of spiritual purification. Former members reported injections, psychological conditioning, and surveillance that kept them in a constant state of fear. Schaefer recorded everything. He had hidden rooms, secret passageways, and files documenting his experiments and punishments. During the 1970s and 80s, Colonia Dignidad became even more sinister when it formed a secret alliance with Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship. The colony was used as a detention and torture center for political dissidents, many of whom disappeared after entering its gates. Schaefer, with his medical background, allegedly assisted in interrogations, and some claim he experimented with truth serums, sensory deprivation, and mind control techniques on prisoners brought in by the military. What's perhaps most chilling is how long it all lasted. Despite multiple investigations, Colonia Dignidad remained untouched for decades, protected by high-level political allies and the colony's extreme secrecy. Victims who escaped were often dismissed or discredited. It wasn't until 1997 that Schaefer finally fled, and not for torture or experimentation, but for a child abuse conviction. He was arrested in Argentina in 2005, extradited to Chile, and sentenced to prison, where he died in 2010. After the fall of the regime, excavations and investigations revealed mass graves, torture equipment, medical records, and evidence of long-term psychological abuse. Survivors still suffer from trauma, dissociation, and health problems stemming from their time in the colony. And yet, despite everything, Colonia Dignidad continued to operate as a private community into the 2000s, rebranding itself and attempting to erase the past. North Korea's secret labs. In the hermit kingdom of North Korea, the regime of the Kim dynasty has built a society fueled by surveillance, fear, and absolute control. But beyond the propaganda and military parades, far from the public eye, lie some of the most horrifying allegations in modern history. State-run human experimentation inside North Korea's vast network of political prison camps. According to testimonies from high-ranking defectors and former prisoners, the North Korean government has operated secret laboratories inside its prison camps, using inmates, including women, children, and entire families, as test subjects for chemical and biological weapons. These aren't baseless rumors. Over the years, multiple defectors have provided consistent and deeply disturbing accounts, painting a picture of a government willing to experiment on its own people in total secrecy. One of the most chilling testimony came from a former prison camp guard who fled to South Korea. He described an incident where 50 prisoners, men, women, and children, were placed in a sealed glass chamber, A poisonous gas was released inside while scientists observed from behind reinforced windows. Within minutes, the families collapsed. Some clutched each other, others vomited, bled, or convulsed violently before dying. The goal? To test the effectiveness of chemical weapons on humans. Other reports describe injections of unknown substances, followed by the rapid deterioration of the test subjects. Prisoners were sometimes starved to the brink of death and then rescued with specific rations just to observe how the human body responded. Pregnant women were forced into labor under observation, sometimes after being exposed to toxic agents, to study the effects on unborn children. North Korean defectors who worked in medical or military facilities claimed that scientists were tasked with developing bioweapons that could be deployed undetected, and that human testing was considered an acceptable, even necessary, part of the process. Some labs were reportedly located within Camp 22, one of the regime's most notorious gulags, often referred to as a complete control district, meaning no one ever left. Due to the extreme secrecy of the regime, verifying these experiments is difficult, but the consistency across multiple witness accounts, including former doctors, military officers, and survivors, paints a haunting picture of state-sanctioned cruelty. The United Nations has taken these allegations seriously. A 2014 UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea concluded that the regime had likely committed crimes against humanity, including torture, forced labor, and possibly biological and chemical experimentation on prisoners. Yet despite these findings, the world has done little to hold North Korea accountable. Geopolitical tensions, nuclear threats, and the regime's isolation have allowed these crimes to continue in the shadows, largely unchecked. The idea of using human beings as test subjects isn't new, but in North Korea, it's uniquely horrifying. Because these aren't rogue experiments, they are systemic, carried out by a government that values loyalty over life and secrecy over justice. In a nation where even speaking a wrong word can mean death, no one resists, and in the silence, experiments continue. The ice pick cure. In the early 20th century, mental illness was poorly understood, heavily stigmatized, and often met with extreme solutions. Asylums were overcrowded, treatments were crude, and many patients were simply locked away for life. In this desperate environment, one man rose to fame claiming he had found a cure, not through talk therapy or medication, but by physically damaging the brain. His name was Dr. Walter Freeman, and he became the face of one of the darkest chapters in psychiatric history, the rise of the lobotomy. A lobotomy is a neurosurgical procedure that involves severing connections in the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain associated with decision-making, personality, and emotional regulation. The theory was simple but brutal. If you could disrupt the brain's emotional pathways, you could reduce symptoms of mental illness like depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. It was first developed in Portugal in the 1930s by neurologist Egas Moniz, who even won a Nobel Prize for the idea. But it was Walter Freeman, an American neurologist, who took the concept and turned it into a national phenomenon. Freeman wasn't a surgeon. He had no formal surgical training, but that didn't stop him. In 1946, he invented a technique called the transorbital lobotomy. Instead of cutting into the skull, he would insert a long, thin instrument, often an actual ice pick, through the corner of the patient's eye socket. Then, with a mallet, he would tap it into the brain and sweep it side to side, severing the frontal lobes. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes, didn't require a sterile operating room, and was often done without anesthesia, just using electroshock to knock the patient unconscious. Freeman traveled across the US in his personal Lobotomobile, performing lobotomies in small-town hospitals, asylums, and even private homes. He marketed the procedure as a miracle, a quick fix for everything from depression to rebellious behavior in teenagers. At the height of his career, he claimed to perform up to 25 lobotomies in a single day. But behind the headlines and photographs of smiling, cured patients was a darker truth. Many of Freeman's patients were left severely disabled, emotionally flat, or completely dependent on lifelong care. Some became incontinent, Others lost the ability to speak. Many were institutionalized permanently, worse off than before the procedure. Some died on the operating table, including one of Freeman's most famous cases, Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. She was lobotomized at age 23 for mood swings and occasional emotional outbursts. The operation left her with the mental capacity of a toddler, and she spent the rest of her life in a care facility. Despite mounting criticism, Freeman continued his work well into the 1950s. By the time he was banned from performing surgery in 1967, he had personally performed over 3,500 lobotomies, more than any other doctor in history. His obsession with the procedure eventually destroyed his reputation, but the damage he left behind, in hospitals, in institutions, in families, was irreversible. Today, the lobotomy is considered one of the greatest ethical failures in modern medicine. It was a procedure based on guesswork and convenience, not science, and it was carried out with shocking confidence, often on people who had no voice to refute. The Toronto experiments. In the early 1970s, a research team at the University of Toronto undertook a psychological study that was as unethical as it was unsettling. Led by researchers working under the growing influence of behaviorist theories, the idea that human actions and identity are shaped almost entirely by environment and conditioning, the experiment focused on one question: can personality be erased and rebuilt in children? To find out, they recruit a group of very young children, some as young as 3 or 4 years old, from troubled families, orphanages, or low-income neighborhoods. These children were placed in what was called a therapeutic observation program designed to monitor and guide their behavior, but in reality, it became something far more sinister, a long-term test of psychological reprogramming. The children were kept in small enclosed rooms for extended periods, with minimal human contact and nearly zero stimulation. No toys, no conversations, no outside interaction. The rooms were painted in dull colors, the lights dim and constant, the silence heavy. Over the course of days, weeks, and in some cases months, the children's sense of time, self, and emotional regulation began to deteriorate. When caregivers did interact, it was often through strictly controlled commands, positive and negative reinforcement, or sudden shifts in tone. Loving one moment, cold the next. The goal, according to internal reports later uncovered, was to flatten the child's personality, to reduce them to a behavioral blank slate. Once the child showed signs of emotional compliance or emptiness, researchers would begin to reintroduce social cues, affection, and environmental factors to test how identity could be rebuilt. Many of the children suffered severe emotional trauma. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others became aggressive or completely detached. In later interviews and lawsuits, former participants described long-term consequences, including nightmares, trust issues, dissociation, and difficulty forming relationships. One subject, as an adult, described it as having your soul rubbed off like chalk from a board and being told who to be from scratch. What's more shocking is that this study, unlike secret CIA projects or military experiments, was carried out in a respected academic institution, backed by public funding, and presented as progressive child psychology. The justification was wrapped in academic language, developing emotional baselines, exploring identity formation, intervention strategies for high-risk youth. But what really happened behind those walls was far closer to emotional warfare than education. Despite public exposure in the late 1980s, few people were held accountable. Much of the documentation was vague or missing, and those involved defended their actions as a product of the time. Several participants attempted to sue the university, but most cases were quietly dismissed or settled out of court. The subway experiments. In the early years of the Cold War, paranoia about a biological attack gripped the United States. The government wanted to know how biological weapons like anthrax or bacteria would spread in a real urban environment. But instead of running simulations, the US military decided to test it on the public without telling them. One of the most shocking cases happened in 1956 and again in 1966, beneath the streets of New York City, in the depths of its massive subway system. The project was part of a larger classified initiative run by the US Army's Special Operation Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the same base where America's biological warfare research was being developed. The operation was called a study of the vulnerability of subway passengers in New York City to covert attack with biological agents, a name that sounds like a textbook, but hides something far more disturbing. To simulate a biological attack, military scientists released harmless but traceable bacteria into the subway system. In the 1966 test, they used a bacteria called Bacillus subtilis var. Niger, chosen because it was believed to be non-harmful but similar enough to more dangerous agents. Scientists dropped light bulb-shaped containers filled with this agent onto the subway tracks. When trains passed, the motion would spread the bacteria into the cars like a real aerosolized biological weapon. The bacteria traveled fast. Within minutes, it had spread across multiple subway lines, exposing thousands, possibly millions, of New Yorkers in a single day. None of them knew. None of them gave consent. There were no warnings, no protections, no follow-up medical care. To the Army, this was a success, proof that biological agents could be deployed with devastating efficiency in a crowded urban setting. And it wasn't just New York. Similar tests were carried out in San Francisco, where in 1950 the US Navy sprayed a cloud of Serratia marcescens, another so-called harmless bacteria, over the city from a ship offshore. Shortly after, a rare outbreak of urinary tract infections occurred at a nearby hospital, and one man died. His family had no idea he had been a test subject in a military experiment. Over the course of 20 years, from the 1940s to the 1960s, the US military conducted at least 239 open-air biological and chemical tests on the public, in subways, on city streets, and even through ventilation systems in large buildings, all in the name of preparedness. It wasn't until the 1970s, when declassified documents surfaced and Senate hearings were held, that the American public began to grasp the scale of the testing. The Department of Defense acknowledged the experiments, but maintained that the agents used were harmless, a claim that has since been challenged by independent scientists and families of those affected. No government agency has ever been held legally accountable for the subway tests, and to this day, most of the people exposed don't even know they were part of it. The remote-controlled brain. In the 1950s and 60s, the world was waking up to the idea that the brain was an electrical machine, that thoughts, emotions, even behavior could be influenced by pulses of current. But for Dr. Jose Manuel Rodriguez Delgado, a Spanish-born neuroscientist working at Yale University, this wasn't just a theory, it was a challenge. He believed that, with the right device, he could control the mind itself, and he set out to prove it. Delgado developed a small implantable device called a stimulus, a combination of electrodes and radio receiver that could be inserted directly into the brain. Once implanted, the stimulus could stimulate specific regions of the brain using a remote control, altering a person's emotions, physical responses, and even decision-making in real time. What sounds like a dystopian nightmare was, in Delgado's mind, a breakthrough. He believed that electrical control of the brain could cure mental illness, eliminate violence, and help reshape society into something more stable. But before it could save the world, it had to be tested, first on animals, and then on humans. In one of his most famous demonstrations, Delgado implanted electrodes into the brain of a fully grown bull. During a live test in a bull ring in Spain, he stood calmly as the animal charged toward him, then pressed the button on his remote. Instantly, the bull stopped mid-charge, confused and disoriented. Delgado had interrupted its aggression with the push of a button. The footage made headlines around the world, but his human experiments were far more unsettling. At Yale, Delgado implanted stimulus into the brain of psychiatric patients, often those deemed violent, schizophrenic, or emotionally unstable. Some of these patients had already been institutionalized for years and were seen as ideal candidates for experimentation. With the device in place, Delgado could trigger emotional shifts, making patients cry, laugh, grow angry, or suddenly relax, all without them knowing why. In one report, A patient was reduced to tears by simulating a single point in her brain. In another, a subject's arm was raised involuntarily, even when he tried to resist, as if someone else had taken control of his body. Delgado described one patient, known only as Patient 15, who became docile and cooperative after repeated stimulation to a specific brain region, a result Delgado believed could one day help treat criminal behavior. Though Delgado insisted his work was ethical and driven by compassion, the implications were terrifying. If a human mind could be controlled remotely, even partially, what stopped governments or military forces from weaponizing the same technology? Delgado's work attracted the attention of the CIA and the US Department of Defense, who were already exploring mind control and behavior modification under programs like MK Ultra. While Delgado refused to cooperate with intelligence agencies, many feared his research would inspire others to take the technology further and in far darker directions. By the 1970s, public backlash against brain manipulation and invasive psychiatry led to stricter regulations, and Delgado's work faded into the background of neuroscience history. He eventually moved to Spain, where he continued his research until retirement. But the legacy of the Stimoceiver lives on. In an age of brain-computer interfaces, neural implants, and artificial intelligence, the idea of a remotely controlled mind no longer sounds like science fiction. It sounds like an early prototype. Project Dreamscape. Since ancient times, humans have believed that dreams could hold meaning, power, or even premonitions. But in the 1970s and 80s, during the height of Cold War paranoia, elements within the US military and intelligence community took this belief to the next level. Under a classified umbrella of psychological and cognitive research programs, a little-known set of experiments, later nicknamed Project Dreamscape, aimed to explore a question no one had dared ask seriously in modern science. Can dream be used as a weapon? The experiments were rooted in growing interest around lucid dreaming, precognitive experiences, and targeted sleep manipulation. This wasn't about dream interpretation. It was about controlling what people saw and felt while unconscious, and then using that control to influence behavior, extract information, or induce fear. The idea was simple. If you could influence a soldier's mind while they were awake, why not take advantage of the 8 hours a night when their conscious defenses were down? Project Dreamscape involved multiple branches: neuroscience labs, psychological operation units, and black-budget contractors. Subjects included military volunteers, trauma patients, and in some cases, prisoners. Many of the participants were told they were being treated for insomnia or PTSD. In reality, they were being tested for how susceptible their dreams were to outside manipulation. In one phase of the experiment, participants were exposed to subliminal audio, white noise embedded with coded language and emotional triggers, played during REM sleep. The goal was to see if nightmares or vivid dreams could be induced on command. In some cases, it worked. Subjects reported recurring visions, dark rooms, interrogation scenes, the sensation of drowning, all without knowing why. In more advanced tests, subjects were injected with experimental drugs meant to increase dream vividness and reduce memory barriers between the subconscious and conscious mind. Some of these compounds were derived from psychedelics, others from classified military pharmacology projects. The results were inconsistent, but often disturbing. Some participants experienced hallucinations that bled into waking life, sleep paralysis episodes so intense they had to be sedated, and in rare cases, full psychological breakdowns. But the most secretive part of Project Dreamscape came when scientists began experimenting with early brainwave imaging, trying to record or reconstruct dream visuals using EEG patterns and, later, crude neural mapping systems. In a few tests, dreamers were shown specific image before sleep, and researchers attempted to detect those same shapes in the electrical signal captured during REM cycles. Though the technology was primitive, some claimed success: blurry, shadowy impression of dream content rendered as ghost-like digital patterns. In the later stages of Project Dreamscape, the experiments became more invasive. Test subjects were given experimental sleep-enhancing drugs, some based on synthetic compounds developed in military bioengineering programs. These chemicals were designed to push the mind into deeper REM cycles while lowering psychological defenses, making the subject more open to dream manipulation, but the results were unpredictable. Some participants experienced waking hallucinations, loss of identity awareness, or confusion between dreams and reality. One subject, upon waking, believed he was still in the dream for over 20 minutes and had to be sedated. There are unconfirmed accounts that the project also explored the possibility of inducing obedience or behavioral shifts through dream reinforcement, using reward-punishment simulations in sleep to alter decision-making while awake. But the research was never published. Much of the documentation vanished after the project was reportedly shut down in the early 1980s, when traces of Project Dreamscape first surfaced in partially declassified budget reports and vague contractor memos. Officials claimed it was simply a cognitive research program with limited scope, but surviving participants, those who figured out what had actually happened to them, tell a different story. Some say their dreams were never the same. Others claim they still wake up with thoughts that don't feel like their own. To this day, the full extent of Project Dreamscape remains unknown. But one thing is clear: even in your sleep, your mind may not be your own. The Havana Syndrome. In late 2016, staff member at the US Embassy in Havana, Cuba, began reporting something strange and terrifying. They described hearing a high-pitched noise, followed by symptoms that seemed completely out of place: dizziness, nausea, ear pain, headaches, confusion, and in some cases, memory loss. It was as if their brains had been shaken, but there was no visible cause. Soon, the reports grew. More embassy staff, both American and Canadian, began experiencing the same symptoms, and then the timeline expanded. Similar incidents were later reported in China, Russia, Austria, Germany, and even Washington, D.C. What began as a localized anomaly became a global pattern, and it quickly became known as Havana Syndrome. Victims described hearing strange sounds, metallic screeches, buzzing, or pressure waves, often in specific rooms or areas. The symptoms would begin almost immediately. Some people collapsed. Others began suffering chronic neurological problems that persisted for months or years. MRIs in some cases show patterns of brain damage, particularly in areas associated with balance, memory, and spatial orientation, the kind of damage you'd expect from a concussion or blast trauma, not from standing still in a hotel room. At first, the US government was cautious, but soon, evacuations began, and investigation escalated. Intelligence agencies began to suspect the involvement of a foreign power using a new, possibly experimental weapon, one based not on bullets or chemicals, but directed energy or sonic attacks. Some speculated the use of microwave weapons, capable of disrupting the nervous system without leaving a trace. Others suggested ultrasound devices, using frequencies too high to hear, but powerful enough to vibrate tissue and affect brain function. But despite multiple investigations by the FBI, CIA, CDC, and even the National Academy of Science, no definitive cause has ever been identified. Theories range from high-tech weaponry to mass psychogenic illness to malfunctioning surveillance gear, but none explain why the symptoms were so consistent, why brain scans showed structural changes, or why seasoned operatives described the experience as being hit by a wave of pressure that scrambles your mind. In 2020, a US intelligence report confirmed that dozens of cases were real and remain unexplained. The CIA later ruled out a widespread campaign by a foreign government, but added that a handful of cases still defy all medical and technical explanations. Even today, more than 200 US personnel and family members are believed to have been affected. For many victims, the fallout has been devastating: permanent disability, cognitive impairment, and abandonment by the very agencies they serve. Some have filed lawsuits, others have gone public, demanding answers. But so far, all they've gotten is uncertainty. The Edgewood Arsenal experiments during the 1950s to 1970s at a US Army facility called Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. A series of secret experiments were carried out to test chemical and psychoactive substances on soldiers, civilians, and in some cases, prisoners. These weren't studies for new medicines. They were designed to evaluate the effects of chemical warfare agents on the human body and mind. Edgewood Arsenal, part of the US Army Chemical Corps, became ground zero for one of the most controversial military testing programs in American history. Over 7,000 volunteers, mostly young enlisted men who were promised safe testing in exchange for lighter duties, were exposed to a catalog of chemical agents, nerve gases, hallucinogens, incapacitating drugs, and mood-altering substances, and a long list of unclassified chemical compounds. In one test, soldiers were given BZ, a powerful delirium known for causing hallucinations, confusion, and violent behavior that could last up to 5 days. The subjects wandered aimlessly, talked to people who weren't there, forgot their own names, and were watched through one-way glass by scientists who took notes. These weren't microdoses. They were pushing the boundaries of what the human mind could endure before breaking. But perhaps even more disturbing were the tests conducted on inmates in state prisons. These men were offered small payments or reduced sentence in exchange for participation, but rarely knew what they were actually being exposed to. One experiment involved injecting inmates with a combination of chemicals designed to induce rage, depression, or extreme anxiety. The goal was to simulate combat stress, but the result was often mental collapse. In some trials, prisoners were given muscle relaxants and then forced to experience overwhelming fear without the ability to move or speak. Researchers watched to see how long it took them to mentally shut down. In another case, subjects were exposed to sarin gas, the same nerve agent later used in terrorist attacks. The men shook, vomited, lost bowel control, and some collapsed. Medical records were often falsified or incomplete, making it nearly impossible for survivors to seek justice. The official justification was national defense. If the US was going to face chemical attacks, the military argued, it had to understand how the human body reacted. But the ethics were clear: no real consent, no medical follow-up, and no accountability. It wasn't until the 1980s and early 90s that veterans and prisoners began filing lawsuits, claiming long-term neurological damage, PTSD, and unexplained illnesses. In 2009, the American Civil Liberties Union filed a class action suit on behalf of test subjects, and in 2012, the US government finally agreed to provide limited medical care and information to victims. But most of the records remain classified or lost. Many victims never even knew what they were exposed to. The Stanford Prison Experiment. In August 1971, in the basement of Jordan Hall at Stanford University, a psychology professor named Dr. Philip Zimbardo created what he claimed would be a simple simulation, a 2-week study of prison dynamics. He recruited 24 healthy college-age male students, offering $15 per day to participate. Then, he randomly assigned them to one of two roles, guards or prisoners, and locked them into a mock prison built beneath the psychology department. What followed was not a study, it was a descent into madness. Within hours of beginning the experiment, things turned dark. The guards, dressed in mirrored sunglasses and khaki uniforms, began asserting dominance. At first, it was small, shouting orders, demanding compliance, but very quickly, the behavior escalated into something no one expected. Guards began humiliating the prisoners, waking them at all hours, enforcing bizarre punishments like push-ups, stripping them naked, or forcing them to simulate sex acts, all while Zimbardo and his team watched and took notes. The prisoners, who had done nothing wrong, began to emotionally break down. One subject, known as Prisoner 8612, suffered a psychological collapse after just 36 hours, screaming and crying uncontrollably. Instead of ending the experiment, Zimbardo believed he was faking and tried to convince him to stay. Another prisoner went on a hunger strike to protest the abuse, and guards responded by throwing him into solitary confinement, a dark, cramped closet. The guards, normal college kids just days earlier, became increasingly sadistic. Some seemed to enjoy the power, others claimed they were just playing a role. Zimbardo himself became so immersed in his role as the prison superintendent that he overlooked the trauma happening right in front of him. The experiment was scheduled to last 2 weeks. It was shut down after 6 days. Not because Zimbardo saw the problem, but because a graduate student named Christina Maslach, who later became his wife, walked in and was horrified by what she saw. She demanded it be stopped. The Stanford prison experiment shocked the world. It suggested that situational power, not personality, could drive ordinary people to commit cruelty. That humans, when given roles in the right environment, could become oppressors overnight. But in the decades since, the study has been heavily criticized. Many researchers have questioned Zimbardo's methods, and evidence has emerged that the guards were coached to act aggressively. Some participants later claimed they were just going along with it because they thought that's what the researchers wanted. Zimbardo himself has admitted to guiding the narrative and letting the abuse continue for dramatic effect. Still, the experiment remained one of the most famous and most ethically debated studies in psychology. Whether it was a legitimate window into human behavior or a staged performance that crossed every ethical line, one thing is clear. It didn't take weeks, or weapons, or war. All it took to turn students into sadists was a basement, a costume, and a little bit of power. The shock machine. In 1961, at Yale University, psychologist Stanley Milgram launched an experiment to answer a terrifying question. Would ordinary people follow orders to hurt someone, even if it meant going against their own conscience? His inspiration came from a real-world horror, the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi official who helped orchestrate the Holocaust. Eichmann's defense was chillingly simple. He claimed he was just following orders. Milgram wanted to find out, could that happen anywhere? Could it happen here? The setup was deceptively simple. Participants, believing they were taking part in a study on memory and learning, were told to play the role of a teacher. They were introduced to another man, the learner, who was supposedly another participant, but was secretly an actor. The teacher would read word pairs aloud, and every time the learner made a mistake, the teacher was instructed to administer an electric shock, increasing in intensity each time. The shock machine went from 15 volts to 450 volts, labeled with terms like moderate, danger, and finally, triple X, severe shock. What the participants didn't know was that no real shocks were being delivered. The learner was acting, but the screams were real, pre-recorded cries of pain, pleading, banging on the wall, and eventually, silence. As the voltage increased, many participants hesitated. They asked questions. Some begged to stop, but seated beside them was a calm man in a lab coat, simply repeating, "Please continue." The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. And shockingly, most of them did continue. 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts, believing they may have seriously injured or even killed the other person. They sweated, trembled, stuttered, but they obeyed, not because they were evil, not because they enjoyed it, but because someone in authority told them to. Milgram published his results in 1963, sparking global controversy. His conclusion was chilling. Ordinary people can become agents in a terrible, destructive process simply by being obedient to authority. But it didn't stop there. Critics later argued that Milgram pressured participants, manipulated them, and blurred the line between study and deception. Some former subjects said they were traumatized after learning the truth. Others said they felt tricked and humiliated. The study remains one of the most ethically debated experiments in psychology, and it changed how research involving human subjects is regulated to this day. The Addiction Lab. In the mid-20th century, during the height of America's battle with heroin addiction, a quiet institution in Lexington, Kentucky, became the epicenter of one of the most unsettling human research programs in US history. It was known as the Narcotic Farm, a hybrid facility that functioned as both a federal prison and a drug rehabilitation center. On paper, it was a place of healing. In reality, it was a laboratory, and the patients, most of them poor, addicted, and desperate, were the test subjects. Run by the US Public Health Service in partnership with addiction researcher and government agencies, the facility welcomed thousands of men over the years. Some court-ordered, others self-admitted in search of recovery. Many believed they were entering a safe space to detox and begin a new life. But once inside, they were offered a choice: participate in drug studies and receive small perks like cigarettes, more comfortable quarters, or shorter sentence, or remain in the general population with no promise of treatment at all. The studies were marketed as medical research, but many of them involved re-exposing recovering addicts to the very drugs they had come to escape. In one long-running series of experiments, men who had gone through the excruciating process of heroin withdrawal were given what they were told were vitamin shots, but were actually injections of morphine or synthetic opioids. Researchers wanted to measure how quickly relapse would occur after detox, how much it took to induce a euphoric high, and how tolerance rebuilt over time. Subjects were closely monitored as their bodies and minds unraveled, sometimes filmed, sometimes observed through one-way mirrors. In other studies, participants were given experimental synthetic drugs with unpredictable effects, stimulant compounds, new sedatives, or altered opioid formulas, many of which had never been tested on humans before. There was little to no follow-up support. Once the data was collected, participants were often sent back to the general population without medical care. Former subjects described vivid hallucinations, crushing depression, and intense cravings, all while surrounded by others in similar states of vulnerability. One man later recalled being locked in a padded cell after a drug trial left him unable to sleep or recognize his own name for days. The doctor behind these experiments published their findings in respected medical journals. They presented at conferences. They were praised for helping to advance the science of addiction, but the truth was rarely acknowledged. The people they studied were not willing, informed participants. They were bargaining for freedom, safety, and dignity, and many were never told what they had really been given. The facility closed in the 1970s, and for decades, the experiments remained buried in archives. But for the thousands who passed through Lexington's doors, the scars didn't fade. Some left more addicted than when they arrived. Others never recovered. The Harvard experiment that broke a brilliant mind. In the early 1960s, at Harvard University, a psychology professor named Dr. Henry A. Murray began conducting a series of experiments that would never pass an ethics board today. His subjects? Bright, impressionable undergraduate students. His goal? To shatter their sense of identity and study what happened after. Dr. Murray, a former OSS operative, predecessor to the CIA during World War II, had a growing interest in psychological warfare, interrogation techniques, and the limits of stress on the human mind. So he designed a study disguised as a test on personality development. But in reality, it was a prolonged campaign of mental and emotional assault. Each participant was told they'd be engaging in a debate-style interview where they would share their personal philosophy of life, their beliefs, values, and deepest thoughts. What they didn't know was that this session would be used against them in the most brutal way possible. In a second surprise session, the students were brought back in, not for discussion, but to be verbally attacked by a team of trained interrogators. These individuals, working under Murray, used insult, mockery, and psychological pressure to dismantle each subject's beliefs. They questioned their intelligence, morality, worldview, anything that could induce emotional collapse. These sessions were filmed, and the students were forced to watch the footage of themselves breaking down over and over again. And this didn't happen once. It happened week after week, sometimes for months. One student who participated in the study later described the experience as brutal psychological torture disguised as academic research. He would go on to develop intense distrust of authority, lasting paranoia, and emotional instability. And his name? Ted Kaczynski, later known to the world as the Unabomber. Before he became a name that would haunt law enforcement for decades, Ted Kaczynski was something else entirely. A quiet, gifted teenager. At just 16 years old, he was accepted into Harvard University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. Socially withdrawn but intellectually brilliant, Kaczynski didn't stand out on campus. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't outspoken. But he had a sharp mind, and that made him the perfect subject for one of Harvard's most controversial experiments. The session went on for over a year. Kaczynski, already introverted and skeptical of authority, began to withdraw even further. After Harvard, he earned a PhD in mathematics and became a professor, but he soon left the academic world entirely. He moved to a remote cabin in Montana, where he lived with no electricity or running water, choosing total isolation. Over time, his writing became increasingly critical of modern society, technology, and the direction he believed civilization was heading. He developed a belief that industrial systems were eroding human freedom, and that the academic and scientific institutions he had once trusted were part of the problem. Between the late 1970s and mid-1990s, a series of dangerous packages were sent to figures in the tech, science, and aviation world, each one carefully constructed and meant to send a message. The individual responsible identified himself as part of a movement called Freedom Club and demanded that his 35,000-word manifesto be published in full by national media outlets. It was only after publication that Kaczynski's own brother recognized the writing style and contacted the authorities. Kaczynski was arrested in 1996. He later accepted a life sentence without the possibility of release. While no single event can explain what led to his transformation, many point back to his time at Harvard, to the year-long psychological experiment that targeted his identity, undermined his sense of reality, and left emotional wounds that never healed. Dr. Murray's study was never formally condemned. There was no apology. It was published as academic research and then quietly forgotten. But for one of its most famous participants, it may have been a turning point, one that sent a brilliant mind down a path of total disillusionment. The Montreal experiments. In the 1950s through the 1970s, inside the quiet halls of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, a respected psychiatrist was carrying out one of the most brutal and disturbing psychological experiments ever conducted in the Western world. His name was Dr. Ewan Cameron, and to the public, he was a pioneer, head of the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations, and a leading voice in mental health reform. But behind closed doors, he was experimenting with techniques designed to erase the human mind and rebuild it from scratch. Cameron believed that mental illness could be cured by first wiping out a person's identity entirely, their memories, their habits, even their sense of self, and then reprogramming them through repeated messages. He called this process psychic driving. Patients who entered his care, often for something as mild as anxiety, depression, or marital difficulties, were subjected to a horrifying process. First, they were placed into a drug-induced coma for days, sometimes weeks. While unconscious, they were made to listen to the same audio message thousands of times on a loop. Things like, "You are not a good mother," or "You are loved by those around you," repeated endlessly through headphones. But what came next was worse. Cameron administered massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, a procedure where electrical currents are passed through the brain to induce seizures. Normally, ECT is used in tightly controlled, brief sessions for severe depression, but Cameron pushed the limits. His patients received up to 40 times the standard voltage, sometimes multiple times a day, far beyond what was considered safe. The results were devastating. Some patients emerged from treatment in a childlike state, unable to recognize their families, speak coherently, or remember how to use a toilet. Others lost decades of memory. They weren't just traumatized, they were mentally erased. And these weren't high-risk cases. Many were housewives, students, or veterans simply looking for help. What they got instead was a one-way ticket into a behavioral control experiment, and most of them had no idea what they were agreeing to. It would later come to light that funding for Cameron's experiments partially came from the US government, funneled through a front organization used to finance sensitive research. While Canada remained silent, American intelligence saw Cameron's work as valuable data on how to break a person's mind and rebuild it to order. After his death, survivors began to speak out. Their stories were heartbreaking: amnesia, fear, cognitive loss, identity confusion. A group of them eventually sued both governments, receiving limited compensation, but no formal apology was ever issued. Most of the documentation remained sealed or destroyed, and the cost was everything that made a person human. Patient H.M. In 1953, a 27-year-old man named Henry Molaison underwent a brain surgery that would change his life and change neuroscience forever. He suffered from severe epilepsy, and doctors believed they had found the source of his seizures deep within his brain, in a region known as the hippocampus. Desperate for relief, Henry agreed to an experimental operation, a bilateral medial temporal lobectomy, a procedure that had never been tested this way before. Surgeons removed parts of his hippocampus and nearby structures on both sides of his brain. The seizures stopped, but when Henry woke up, something else was gone: time. Henry could remember everything from before the surgery: his childhood, his family, the layout of his house. But from the moment he opened his eyes after the operation, he could no longer form new memories. Every conversation, every face, every moment disappeared from his mind in a matter of seconds. He would meet someone, smile, talk to them, and then forget they existed. He could no longer recognize the doctors who had treated him for years. He would read the same magazine article again and again, never realizing he had already read it. He lived in a permanent present, trapped in a loop of forgetting, endlessly meeting the same people, endlessly waking up into the same confusion. And the worst part? He was aware something was wrong. He would sometimes say, "Every day is alone in itself." Henry became known to the world only as patient HM, his identity protected for decades as researchers studied him. Dozens of scientists, psychologists, and neurologists ran tests on him for over 50 years, all trying to understand how memory worked by watching someone who had none. They asked him to draw pictures, solve puzzles, read stories. He could learn motor tasks, like drawing a shape in a mirror, but he never remembered learning them. His muscles remembered what his mind could not. He became a living blueprint for how the brain stores memory, how short-term becomes long-term, how identity is built over time. Without meaning to, HM became the most studied single human being in the history of brain science. But while researchers celebrated the discoveries, Henry lived in a quiet, repeating fog. He never traveled again. He never built new relationships. He never knew what decade it was. And yet, he was kind, gentle, polite, even if he forgot your name 2 minutes later. When he passed away in 2008, his brain was preserved and sliced into over 2,400 thin sections to be studied for generations. His name was finally revealed, Henry Molaison, and his story was told in full. But it raises a haunting question. If memory is what makes us who we are, then what's left when memory is taken away? Patient HM didn't just lose time. He lost the ability to ever move forward. And scientists watched it happen every single day. The silent experiment. There was a time when human experiments happened in hospitals, prisons, or secret bunkers, behind locked doors and under classified files. But not anymore. Today, the most powerful experiment in human history is happening right now. And the subjects aren't just a few volunteers, it's everyone. Every time you open an app, pause on a post, click a video, scroll for a little longer, you're feeding it. Algorithms track what you like, what you hate, how long you look at a face, which words make you angry, which image makes you stop. And behind the scenes, a system is running millions of behavioral tests per second, not to serve you, but to see what keeps you hooked. In 2014, Facebook ran an experiment on nearly 700,000 users. They changed the emotional tone of their news feeds. Some were shown only uplifting stories, other mostly negative ones, to see if they could influence mood. And they did. People's posts shifted, the language changed, and no one was told it was happening. That was just the start. Every platform you use now, social media, streaming, shopping, is testing you. Every scroll is an A/B test. Every click is a data point. The system doesn't ask what you want. It predicts what will keep you looking, even if that means feeding you outrage, misinformation, or anxiety. You are being studied, not once, constantly, not with needles or wires, with data, timing, and design. It's not just what you see, it's what you don't. The friends you never hear from again. The content buried beneath the algorithm. The choices you weren't allowed to make because you never knew they existed. And here's the most disturbing part. There is no control group, no off switch, no signed form. Because this isn't called an experiment anymore. It's called user experience. And while we were busy liking, sharing, swiping, scrolling, they figured out how to shape behavior without us even noticing. The old experiments ended when the test was done. This one never stops. Because we are the experiment, and we don't even know what we're becoming. And that wraps up our deep dive into the darkest human experiments in history. If you've made it this far, thank you. This wasn't an easy video to watch, but I think it's important to remember these stories. Because they weren't just experiments. They were real people, real lives, and a lot of what happened was never supposed to be known. If you found this video interesting, feel free to leave a like. It really helps more people discover it. And if you want to see more stories like this, true history, strange science, and the hidden side of humanity, hit that subscribe button. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.